My name is Oilia Owens, and I'm 34 years old. 3 weeks after I gave birth to my daughter, I stood in my own kitchen, holding her against my shoulder, while my mother told me to pack. Not asked, told. My brother's family needed the house, she said, and I could find a rental because I was strong, and they mattered more. She said it the way someone reads a bus schedule, calm, ordinary, unquestionable. But there was one detail my family had completely forgotten in all their planning. One line of print on one piece of paper filed at the county recorder's office. What my mother did to my daughter's nursery just 2 weeks later still makes my hands go cold. And what I finally said through the intercom that Sunday morning made her drop her phone right there on my front walk. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones in the family finally tell the whole story, from beginning to end, in their own steady voice. If stories about family, boundaries, and the price of finally saying no speak to you, leave a comment and subscribe. This story begins in a kitchen that belonged to me, but before that kitchen scene can mean anything, you need to meet the girl who paid for that kitchen. So let me take you back. I've been a NICU nurse in Dayton, Ohio for the past 12 years. Neonatal intensive care, the floor where babies no bigger than your hand fight for their lives, and panic is a luxury we don't have the privilege to prescribe. I put myself through nursing school with student loans and double shifts at a diner. Nobody in my family came to my pinning ceremony because my brother, Brent, had a baseball tournament that weekend. And in the Owens family, that's just how the math worked. I was the strong one. That wasn't just a compliment. It was my title, my job description, and, as I would eventually learn, my sentence. When Brent needed money for his wedding, the strong one loaned it. And we all quietly agreed that loaned really meant gave. When Dad died 2 years ago, and Mom couldn't afford the apartment on her own, the strong one had a spare bedroom, didn't she? Whenever anything in our family broke, leaked, failed, or cried, they passed it to me the way you pass a dirty dish to the person standing closest to the sink. And here's the confession that matters, the one this entire story turns on. I liked it. Being needed was the only currency my family had ever accepted from me. So I kept paying it, year after year, convincing myself that someday the invoice would finally come back stamped with one word I had spent my whole life waiting to receive. Love. My mother has said many things to me since that March, but the truest sentence anyone has ever said about me came from my friend Rosa in the hospital break room. She looked at me one night and said, You've been tipping people your whole life just for letting you sit at their table. It took a newborn and a moving truck to teach me she was right. The house came before the baby, and I want you to know exactly what that house cost, because everyone in this story would later become remarkably casual about it. 6 years ago, when I was 28, I signed the papers for a 3-bedroom house on Marigold Lane, a tired little colonial with a crooked maple tree out front and a porch that sagged like the face of a kind old friend. The down payment wasn't inherited. It was built out of night shifts. It was 6 straight years of working Christmases, so nurses with children could stay home with their families. It was every holiday differential, every extra weekend, every overtime shift carefully tracked in a spreadsheet I kept like a prayer. My name went on the deed. My name went on the mortgage. And on the very first night, I slept on the empty living room floor because I had a house before I had a couch. Lying there in that empty room, I felt something I had never once felt at an Owens family table. I felt landed. I felt safe. I felt like something was finally mine. The next morning, my neighbor, Miss D, 70 years old and as sharp as a tack, brought over a pan of warm cornbread and smiled as she handed it to me. "A woman who buys her own house learns who she is, honey," she said. "Usually the hard way." I laughed because I thought she was talking about mortgages and home repairs. I didn't realize she was quietly reading me my future. 2 years ago, after Dad died, Mom moved into the downstairs bedroom, and I never charged her a single dime. I never wanted to. But somewhere during those 2 years, something subtle changed. At church, when she talked to her friends. On the phone with Aunt Ruth. My house slowly became the family house. Not Oilia's house. The family house. As though it had been passed down through our bloodline, instead of earned one exhausting night shift at a time through my own paychecks. I noticed it. I even corrected it once or twice gently. Every time I got the same little laugh, the same dismissive wave of the hand. "You're so touchy about paperwork." My mother has said many things to me since March. but the truest sentence anyone ever spoke about me came from my friend Rosa in the hospital break room. She looked at me, smiled sadly, and said, "Girl, you've been tipping people your whole life just for letting you sit at their table." It took a newborn baby and a moving truck for me to realize she was right. The house came before the baby, and I want you to understand exactly what it cost, because everyone in this story would later become very casual about that. 6 years ago, when I was 28, I signed the papers for a 3-bedroom colonial on Marigold Lane, a tired little house with a crooked maple tree and a porch that sagged like the face of a kind old friend. Every dollar of the down payment came from night shifts, holiday differentials, double weekends and Christmases I worked, so other nurses with children could stay home. Every sacrifice was tracked on a spreadsheet I guarded like a prayer. My name was the only name on the deed. My name was the only name on the mortgage. The first night I slept there, I lay on the empty living room floor because I owned a house before I owned a couch. And for the first time in my life, I felt something no Owens family dinner had ever given me. I felt grounded. I felt like I finally belonged somewhere. The next morning, my 70-year-old neighbor, Miss D, brought over warm cornbread and smiled. "A woman who buys her own house learns who she is, honey," she said. "Usually the hard way." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. 2 years later, after my father died, my mother moved into the downstairs bedroom. I never charged her rent. I never wanted to. But somewhere during those 2 years, something quietly changed. At church with her sisters on calls with Aunt Ruth, my home slowly stopped being Oilia's house and became the family house, as though it had been passed down through generations, instead of earned one exhausting night shift at a time. I noticed it. I corrected it once or twice, gently, only to get a dismissive laugh and a wave of the hand. "You're so touchy about paperwork, Oilia." Remember that sentence. My daughter Nora arrived on the 3rd of March, 3 weeks early, impatient to meet the world. Her father and I had quietly ended things during my 5th month of pregnancy, and I won't waste this story on him. He simply chose not to be part of it. So it was Rosa holding my hand in the delivery room, and then it was just me and my 6-pound baby girl with her grandmother's stubborn chin. I had never been so terrified or so certain of anything in my life. People never tell you what it's like to be a NICU nurse who suddenly becomes a mother. You know too much. Every breath becomes something you count without thinking. And despite everything you know, you still heal the same way everyone else does. Slowly. Exhausted, bleeding, and trying to do everything with one free hand. To be fair, my mother did help during those first weeks. She cooked meals, washed laundry, and held Nora so I could shower. But help in Carol Owens's hands was never free. It was scaffolding, and scaffolding only goes up around something that someone plans to work on. She had opinions about the formula, the thermostat, the nursery, and even the soft sky blue paint I had carefully chosen for Nora's room. Years earlier, I had learned how to set small boundaries with her. When she offered to take over my checking account after the baby arrived, I smiled and said no, twice. When she reorganized my kitchen, I quietly put everything back where it belonged after she went to bed. I convinced myself it was just grief mixed with grandmotherly excitement. Then, one Tuesday morning in late March, my brother Brent lost his house to the bank. By that same afternoon, my mother had already decided whose house would solve his problem, without asking me a single question. She stood in my kitchen, and I keep saying my kitchen on purpose because she stood there as though she owned it. I was only 3 weeks postpartum, wearing a nursing tank under a robe, with Nora asleep against my shoulder, warm as fresh bread. My mother calmly set down her coffee, folded her hands, and announced that Brent, his wife Kayla, and their children would be moving into the house during the first week of May, as soon as the foreclosure was finalized. The children would take the upstairs bedrooms, including mine and the nursery. Brent and Kayla would move into the downstairs room. And I, she explained as casually as if she were discussing tomorrow's weather, should start looking for a small rental because, "You're strong, Oilia. You'll land on your feet. You always do." I actually laughed, a tiny, stunned sound, because I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. I stared at her and said, "Mom, this is my house." She looked back at me with the same tired patience she had used my entire life, as though I were arguing over an expired coupon, and calmly delivered the sentence I will hear for the rest of my life. Make room for your brother's family. They matter more. Not, you've always managed. Not, it's only temporary. None of the softer versions she would later repeat to relatives. Just those 4 devastating words. They matter more. My 3-week-old daughter was breathing softly against my neck, while my own mother told me, in my own home, that someone else deserved it more than we did. The kitchen became so quiet I could hear the maple branches scratching against the gutter outside. And I did exactly what 34 years of conditioning had taught me to do. Nothing. I stood there with my mouth full of facts. The deed, the mortgage, 6 years of night shifts, every overtime paycheck, and swallowed every single one because the strong one never made scenes. My mother picked up her coffee again, completely satisfied, and casually added that Kayla would stop by on Thursday to measure the rooms. To her, my silence meant what it had always meant: agreement. She had no idea she was about to discover otherwise. I gave it one honest adult attempt. That night, after Nora's 10 o'clock feeding, I came downstairs, sat across from my mother, and explained everything the same way I gave patient reports at the hospital, calmly, clearly, and with every fact in order. The deed is in my name. The mortgage is in my name. No one is moving into this house, and no one is moving out, especially not a newborn baby in April. I told her I truly felt sorry for Brent, and that I would gladly help him find a rental if he wanted it. I believed that was generous. I believed the conversation was over. She listened without interrupting, tilted her head, and summed up her entire philosophy in one sentence. Paperwork doesn't make a family, Oilia. Sacrifice does. Then she calmly informed me that all the arrangements had already been made, as though reality worked like a church casserole schedule, and went upstairs to sleep in the room I had given her for free. But the moment that truly chilled me came just after midnight. I came downstairs for a glass of water and heard her talking softly through her bedroom door. She was on the phone with Aunt Ruth, speaking with complete confidence, discussing which weekend the moving truck was booked, which church members' sons would help carry furniture, and exactly how Brent's children's beds would fit into Nora's nursery once my baby's crib had been taken apart. The moving truck had already been booked, before my mother ever spoke a single word to me in my kitchen. That conversation had never been a discussion. It was nothing more than a courtesy call after every decision had already been made. The very next morning, Kayla added me to a family group chat called Moving Day, with a little truck emoji. 11 relatives were already in it. The moving date was pinned. Everything was arranged except one small detail. They had forgotten to ask the woman who actually owned the house. On the first Sunday of May, I stood in my bathroom, running my thumb across my C-section scar, doing the kind of math no spreadsheet could ever calculate. Then I called my brother because, despite everything, some stubborn part of me still believed in him. Brent is 29, 5 years younger than me, and I practically helped raise him. I walked him to school while Mom worked long shifts after Dad's first layoff. I taught him how to parallel park. I even loaned him money for his wedding, a loan we all quietly understood would never be repaid. I called him during his lunch break and kept my voice calm. "Brent," I said, "I'm so sorry about the house. I know how scared you must be, but I need you to hear this from me, not through Mom. You can't move into my home. I'll help you find a place. I'll even help with the deposit if I can. But this house has a 3-week-old baby in it, and it isn't available." There was a long silence. I could hear Kayla's television in the background before my little brother finally answered in a voice I barely recognized. "Mom already promised us the house. The kids are excited about the yard." When I gently reminded him that it wasn't Mom's house to promise, he sighed as though I were the difficult one, like I was traffic delaying his plans, and repeated the same family script I'd heard my whole life. "You're the strong one, Oilia. You'll be fine anywhere. It's different for us." I ended the call and understood something with the cold clarity that only comes in triage. My brother was never going to save me because he had never been expected to save anyone. That had always been my shift. An hour later, Aunt Ruth called with a voice sweet enough to hide the knife, asking whether I was really going to let my nephews sleep in a shelter, even though nobody was anywhere close to being homeless. Brent had severance pay and 2 solid job offers. By dinner, cousins I hadn't heard from in years had already heard a version of the story where I was selfishly hoarding a large empty house while children suffered. The Owens family rumor machine was running exactly the way it always had, and I had spent my entire life feeding that machine with explanations, only to watch them get reshaped into whatever story my mother wanted told. So for the first time, I stopped explaining. I went upstairs, opened the fireproof box in my closet, pulled out the deed, and read my own name on it twice beneath the bedside lamp. Then I started reading everything else. One benefit of belonging to the nurses' union is the legal hotline almost nobody remembers exists until life catches fire. During Nora's afternoon feeding, while she slept peacefully against my chest and I balanced a notepad on my knee, I called. A patient attorney named Ms. Alvarez carefully walked me through the legal landscape of my own home like a surveyor mapping property lines. Ohio law is straightforward, she explained. Your mother has lived there for 2 years and receives her mail there. That likely makes her a tenant at will. You cannot simply change the locks or leave her belongings on the lawn, no matter whose name is on the deed. If you want her to leave, you must serve proper written notice, give 30 days, and if she refuses, go through the court. Do everything by the book, because if you don't, it can come back on you. I wrote every instruction down as carefully as I documented discharge orders for my patients. Then she added the part that mattered even more. Your brother and his family are completely different. They have never lived in your house. They are not tenants. They are guests. And guests remain in your home only as long as you allow them to. If they show up expecting to move in without your permission, that is no longer a family disagreement. It becomes a legal matter. That's trespassing, Miss Alvarez said calmly. And if they show up trying to move in without your permission, you can stand behind your locked door, call the non-emergency police line, and do it with a completely clear conscience. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat quietly for a long time, Nora's tiny breaths rising and falling against my chest like the steady ticking of a little clock. My family had a moving truck, a group chat, 11 relatives, and a story they all believed, that they were entitled to my home. I had something far quieter but far stronger, a deed, the law, and a process. Before hanging up, Ms. Alvarez had left me with one final sentence that stayed with me. Your mother has rights, and so do you, honey. The only question is, which one of you is actually willing to use them? What happened next wasn't shouting. Shouting I understood. I grew up with it. I worked in emergency rooms where raised voices were just another kind of weather. What came instead was warmer and far more dangerous. Shame arrived wrapped in casseroles, Bible verses, and voicemail messages that always began with, "Sweetheart," Aunt Ruth called twice a day, reminding me that family is all we have. She reminded me that my mother had buried her husband, that Brent's boys kept asking about their aunt. My mother's church friend Eileen, a woman I had met exactly 3 times, called to tell me she was praying for my heart to soften. Kayla posted a photo in the family group chat of her boys sleeping on an air mattress with the caption, "Can't wait for the big yard. So blessed." Every message followed the exact same blueprint. No one claimed I didn't own the house. They simply treated ownership like an inconvenient technicality, the sort of detail polite people weren't supposed to mention. The entire campaign rested on the oldest beam holding up my personality, the one my family had leaned on my whole life. Oilia handles things. Oilia doesn't make life harder. Oilia sacrifices. But 12 years in a NICU teaches you a discipline most people never learn. When a situation starts falling apart, you don't match its panic. You document it. So I became a nurse handling my own family. I saved every voicemail. I took screenshots of every group chat message. I dated everything. I kept a small spiral notebook beside the coffee maker and filled it with times, conversations, and exact quotes. Not because a judge would care what Aunt Ruth thought about my heart, but because writing something down keeps it from rewriting you at 2 o'clock in the morning. My instincts kept begging me to explain, apologize, and smooth everything over. Instead, my hands kept documenting. The strong one was still working the case, but for the first time in her life, the patient she was protecting was herself. The Thursday visit showed me just how far ahead of me they already were. Kayla came over to look at the rooms, and I allowed it, for exactly 10 polite minutes, because some part of me was still performing reasonable for the family committee. She walked through the upstairs with her phone out, taking pictures of my bedroom, the nursery, and every closet while narrating measurements to Brent on speakerphone. As she was leaving, she smiled, jingled her keys in a friendly little wave, and I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Hanging between a gym key fob and a grocery store rewards tag was a brass key I recognized instantly, the key to my own front door. I asked, as calmly as I could, where she had gotten it. "Oh," she said casually. "Mom Carol had copies made a few weeks ago. You know, just for convenience. For the transition. Weeks ago. I stood in my doorway long after she drove away, quietly doing the math. Weeks ago was before Brent's foreclosure had even been finalized. That meant the plan existed before the emergency. The foreclosure hadn't created the plan. It had simply become the excuse for it. That night, the family group chat lit up again, and by pure accident, Kayla sent a message meant for her sister-in-law into the main thread. Alongside a laughing emoji, she wrote, "Brent measured the little blue room last Tuesday. The crib won't fit with both boys. It'll have to come down anyway. I read it twice, last Tuesday, while I had been at Nora's pediatrician appointment. My brother had walked through my house with a tape measure, standing in my baby's nursery, measuring the room where my daughter slept. While my mother unlocked the door and welcomed him inside without saying a single word to me, I looked at the brass hook beside my front door where I had always kept the spare keys, trusting the people I loved, and suddenly the whole house felt different. It no longer felt occupied by family. It felt occupied by people making plans for someone else's property. The only thing they hadn't settled yet was the date. Even then, I gave my mother one final chance. Sunday evening, after Nora had fallen asleep, we sat across from each other with tea at the same kitchen table where she had first announced her plans. I finally asked the question I had been swallowing since I was 9 years old. "Mom, when I worked diner shifts to pay for nursing school, when Dad died and I opened my home to you, when I spent my whole life holding everyone else together, where was the person holding me? Why does being the strong one always mean I get less?" She looked at me for a long moment, and for one brief second, I thought I saw something soften behind her eyes. I thought we might finally meet each other honestly. Then it disappeared. "You're the strong one," she said gently, almost affectionately, as though she were offering me praise instead of a sentence. "Brent isn't built like you. He needs someone to hold the ground beneath him. You never did." There it was, the Owens family religion, spoken aloud in my own kitchen. The strong one needs nothing. The strong one is a resource, not a relative. She reached across the table, patted my hand, and said something that wouldn't make sense until weeks later, when she stood at my front door holding a cardboard box. "You think I don't know what this costs?" she whispered. "I know better than you ever will." I didn't understand her then. I was too exhausted, too sore, and too quietly furious to ask what she meant. But remember those words, because a few weeks later she would open them like a locket, and inside was the story of a farm in Preble County and a little girl I had never known. Then the practical pressure began, because guilt alone wasn't moving me fast enough. I still had 5 weeks left of maternity leave, only half of it paid. The mortgage didn't care that I had just given birth. My emergency savings had survived the delivery, but only barely. Hospital bills don't disappear just because you're a single mother. And my own mother, who had happily held Nora every morning so I could steal 1 extra hour of sleep, suddenly became impossibly busy. She had church commitments. She had Aunt Ruth. She had headaches. And one morning, standing in my kitchen with her coat already on, she looked at me and said, almost thoughtfully, "If you need this much help, Olia, maybe you shouldn't be so eager to push family out of the house." There it was, the net being pulled up slowly so I could watch every knot tighten. My mother wasn't simply refusing to help anymore. She was putting a price on it. Childcare, casseroles, a grandmother's arms at 3 a.m, every bit of it would be mine again the moment I surrendered the keys to my own home. I want to be honest with you, because this is the part nobody says out loud. It almost worked. I was 6 weeks postpartum, exhausted in the way only new mothers understand, doing daycare math against a nurse's salary while trying to keep my head above water. There was a version of surrender I could have dressed up as love. One big family under the same roof, cousins growing up together, my mother's help returned. All it would have cost was the house I'd worked 6 years to buy, and the last piece of myself I still owned. What kept me from giving in wasn't courage. It was Rosa, who started showing up every Tuesday and Friday with groceries and never once made me feel guilty. And Miss D, who quietly sat on her porch facing my driveway like a faithful lighthouse with knitting in her lap. Two women who shared none of my blood carried more of my weight than my entire family ever had. I noticed who was truly showing up for me, and I wrote that down too. Nora's 6-week checkup fell on a Thursday morning. She was healthy, gaining weight perfectly, with strong little lungs. The pediatrician laughed and called her a linebacker in a onesie, and for one beautiful hour I was simply a proud mother, hidden behind a paper curtain, with no group chats, no guilt, no casseroles, and no family politics. We got home a little after 11. The garage door was open. My mother's car was in the driveway, and Kayla's SUV sat behind it. I stepped into the garage carrying Nora's car seat and stopped cold. My daughter's crib had been taken apart. Every white rail and slat was stacked neatly against the paint cans like lumber. The mattress leaned beside it, still covered with the fitted sheet decorated with little yellow moons and clouds. Her mobile, the one with the felt stars I'd hung while 9 months pregnant and crying over everything, was coiled inside a hardware store bag resting on top. Upstairs, I could hear my mother's cheerful voice floating through the nursery as she told Kayla where the boys' bunk beds would go after they repainted the walls, something less babyish. They hadn't waited until moving day. They hadn't waited for my permission. While I sat in a pediatrician's office celebrating my daughter's health, my mother had dismantled her bed inside the home I owned. I didn't march upstairs. I didn't scream. I stood in the cool garage with one hand on Nora's car seat and the other resting against the smooth white crib rail I'd sanded with my own hands the previous August. Then something settled over me, the same calm that comes during a crisis in the NICU, when panic serves no purpose and only the next correct decision matters. I looked down at my sleeping daughter. Her tiny lashes curved like commas across her cheeks, and whispered for the first time, "This is my house." Here's what I did not do, and 12 years of night shifts deserve the credit. I didn't storm upstairs. I didn't carry the crib pieces into the nursery, or give Kayla the emotional explosion her phone camera was clearly hoping to capture. A video of unstable Oilia would have fueled that family group chat for the next year. Instead, I carried my daughter inside, walked calmly past the blue nursery, while my mother was still discussing paint colors, smiled politely, and said, "There's coffee in the pot." Then I went to my bedroom and quietly closed the door. And in that room, with Nora asleep against my chest, I finally did something the strong one had never allowed herself to do. I triaged my own family. Black tag, red tag, green tag. Who could still be saved? Who was beyond saving? Who was only wounded? My brother, red tag, salvageable maybe, but only someday, in a different season of his life. My brother, red tag, maybe salvageable someday, but not by me and not today. Aunt Ruth and the rest of the chorus, black tag. You don't waste compressions on people who were never breathing for you in the first place. And then there was my mother. My mother, whom I'd loved with the desperate hope of a daughter still auditioning for approval at 34. I sat with that truth for a long time. Then I looked at my 6-week-old daughter sleeping peacefully in my arms. One day, if I didn't stop this cycle, she would become the strong one too. The next woman expected to carry everyone else's weight. I wasn't going to hand her that inheritance. It wasn't my mother I finally let go of. It was the audition. The constant need to earn a place that should have been mine from the beginning. The audition was over. I picked up my phone and ignored the family group chat. Instead, I sent 3 messages. One to the locksmith whose magnet had hung on my refrigerator for 6 years. One to Miss Alvarez at the legal helpline. And one to Rosa. 3 short texts. No panic, no drama. Just the next correct steps because the plan was already complete. If you've ever been the strong one in your family, the one who always fixes everything, I want you to tell me in the comments what it cost you, because I know I'm not the only one. And if this story feels painfully familiar, subscribe and stay with me. The truck was still coming. Before it arrived, I made one final offer in writing because I wanted the record to show exactly who had tried to solve this peacefully. I texted Brent and copied Mom as calmly as writing discharge notes after a shift. I told him I'd found 3 rental homes within 2 miles of the boys' school and that I would personally pay the first 2 months' deposit as a gift. That's what I can do, I wrote. And I can do it with love. What I cannot do is give you this house. Nora's home is not on the table. I attached the rental listings. Real links, real addresses, real square footage. A genuine solution that offered more than anyone had ever offered me in 34 years. Kayla replied with nothing but a thumbs down emoji. That one tiny symbol told me everything. Families facing real homelessness don't reject 2 months of free rent. They didn't want shelter. They wanted my house. A few minutes later, my mother came upstairs and stood in my doorway, wearing an expression I'd only ever seen her use on waitresses who brought the wrong order. "A deposit?" she said. "You'd rather pay strangers than let your own family stay here?" I looked at her and answered quietly, "They aren't strangers. It's Brent's rent. And you're right. Family isn't a lease agreement." I paused before adding, "Because at least a lease gets honored." She didn't smile. She didn't argue. She simply straightened her shoulders and delivered her verdict like a judge reading a sentence. "They move in the first Sunday of May. Be reasonable and keep the small bedroom. Or don't. That's your choice." I noticed then that everything in our family was always called my choice, right after someone else had already made it for me. She turned and walked downstairs, leaving me sitting on my bed, listening to my own house feel less like home than it ever had before. I stared at the calendar and whispered to myself, "All right, Sunday. Now we both have a date." But the hardest blow of that week hadn't arrived yet, and it didn't come directly from my mother. Or maybe it did. I'll never be able to prove it. Wednesday morning, just after 10, there was a knock at the door. A polite woman wearing a county badge and carrying a clipboard introduced herself as a Children's Services investigator. Someone had filed a report claiming there were concerns about my 6-week-old daughter, an unstable home, erratic behavior, a possible postpartum mental health crisis. She was professional, respectful, and simply doing the job she was required to do, something I can appreciate now that enough time has passed. She found a spotless home, a full pantry, a healthy baby, and a mother who could produce every pediatric record within 90 seconds, because documenting facts is what NICU nurses do for a living. 20 minutes later, the investigation was closed. Unfounded. "Have a good day, ma'am," the caseworker said, before walking back to her car. I closed the front door, leaned against it, and shook for the next hour. Not because I thought I'd done anything wrong, but because I finally understood what had just happened. Someone in my own family had aimed the machinery of the state at me and my 6-week-old daughter as a pressure tactic in a fight over my house. That realization changes something inside a person. Later that afternoon, Aunt Ruth posted in the family group chat without any prompt, "Well, some people are clearly under too much strain to be making big decisions alone." A few seconds later, my mother replied with nothing but a praying hands emoji. I didn't answer. I opened my notebook instead and wrote down the exact time. If there had ever been a road back, some future Sunday dinner where everyone pretended none of this had happened, it ended that Wednesday. They hadn't only tried to take my home. They had tried, if only for 20 terrifying minutes, to paint me as a danger to the little girl I loved more than my own life. You don't negotiate with something like that. You don't leave the door open for it to happen twice. By the time Sunday arrived, there would be nothing about me left unlocked. Thursday night, after Nora's 10 o'clock feeding, I sat alone at my kitchen table with 3 documents spread neatly in front of me, preparing for the quietest act of self-protection I had ever committed. Thursday night, after Nora's 10 o'clock feeding, I committed the quietest act of courage of my life. First came the notice. Miss Alvarez had explained every step. 30 days, written, dated, delivered properly. To Carol Owens, you are hereby notified to vacate the premises at 414 Marigold Lane within 30 days. My hand stayed steady until I reached the signature line. Then it trembled. I let it. And I signed anyway. That's when it struck me that some signatures end a marriage, while others end a childhood. Mine ended the second. I placed the notice on the kitchen table beside the teapot where my mother always drank her morning tea, because for better or worse, I was still my mother's daughter, and presentation mattered. Second, I confirmed the locksmith's appointment for the very first moment the law would allow. Not an hour early, not a minute late. I was determined to do every step so cleanly that it could survive an audit by God himself. Third, I saved the police non-emergency number to my favorites and placed a folder by the front door containing the deed. Mortgage statement, a copy of the eviction notice, and my ID. all secured with a rubber band like an emergency kit for a disaster I could already hear approaching. Then, I sat alone in the dark kitchen of the house I'd bought at 28 and allowed myself exactly one pot of tea to grieve. Not for the house. The house was finally safe, or at least it would be. I grieved for the version of my mother I'd spent my entire life believing still existed somewhere beneath the disappointment. The mother I kept imagining would one day look at me, truly see me, and say, "You've carried enough. Sit down. I'll take it from here." I buried that fantasy at my own kitchen table that night. The real Carol Owens would find the paperwork at breakfast. Some locks once changed change you too. I signed those papers knowing that, and slept better than I had in weeks. My mother found the notice at exactly 7:15 the next morning. I know because I was upstairs feeding Nora in the rocking chair when the entire house fell into a strange, unmistakable silence. The silence of someone reading words they never expected to see. I'd prepared myself for shouting, accusations, maybe even tears. What she did instead was far more dangerous. Nothing. No screaming from the kitchen. No ripped-up notice. By the time I came downstairs, she was standing at the counter wearing her good coat, her suitcase already packed, her untouched teacup beside the neatly folded notice as though it were an invitation she had politely declined. Then, with the calm expression of a saint in a stained glass window, she looked at me and said quietly, "I won't stay where I'm not wanted. I'll be staying with Ruth. When you come to your senses, you know the number," my mother said quietly. Then she leaned down, kissed Nora on the forehead, not me, and wheeled her suitcase down my front walk with her back perfectly straight. Before reaching the sidewalk, she paused and gave a graceful little wave toward Miss D's porch, making absolutely certain she had a witness. It was masterful. She had turned a legal notice she couldn't fight into a public performance of being banished. By noon, the family version of the story had spread everywhere. Oilia served her own widowed mother eviction papers like a stranger. She forced her out with legal notices at the breakfast table. The family group chat filled with broken heart emojis, and my phone buzzed non-stop like a hornet trapped inside a jar. I'll tell you honestly what I felt because I promised I'd tell the truth. First came relief. God forgive me. The downstairs bedroom stood empty, and the whole house seemed to breathe easier. Then came grief. And after that, something I never expected. Professional admiration. The cold kind. One strategist recognizing another. She had left 12 days early, not because she had to, but because it allowed her to control the narrative. What she didn't realize was that by leaving voluntarily, she'd made my own position stronger than ever. That evening, Miss D walked across the yard carrying a pot of homemade soup and settled into my kitchen like a one-woman tribunal. At 70, after burying 2 husbands and raising 4 children in the same house, she had no patience for small talk. "Your Aunt Ruth called Darlene from church," she said. And Darlene called me. "Want to know what they're saying?" I answered honestly. "Not really." She nodded in approval, and told me anyway because, in her words, information is ammunition, and she believed in sharing ammunition with people she cared about. Then she laid her spoon down and gave me a speech I wish I'd framed. "Honey, I've watched you shovel this driveway by yourself for 6 years. I've watched you come home from night shifts and mow this lawn at 7 in the morning while pregnant because the grass wasn't going to cut itself. I never once saw a brother. I never once saw a moving truck bringing help. I know whose house this is, and so does everyone on this street with eyes. Let them gossip in their family group chat. This neighborhood has one too, and you'd be surprised who's in it." I laughed then. Really laughed. Loud, ugly, uncontrollable laughter. Nora jumped at the sound, and somehow that made me laugh even harder. That moment mattered more than I can explain. Not because I needed people to take my side, but because shame cannot survive in daylight. And Miss D carried daylight around in a soup pot. Before she left, she looked at the new deadbolt, then at the folder waiting beside my front door, and said the words that stayed with me forever. "You've spent your whole life asking permission from people who were never going to give it. Locks are just a way of deciding you don't have to ask anymore." She promised she'd be sitting on her porch knitting early Sunday morning, watching. The locksmith arrived Saturday. By then, my mother had packed every one of her belongings, moved herself into Aunt Ruth's house, announced it to the entire family, and even texted me, "Don't wait on me. I don't live where I'm not wanted." Miss Alvarez read the message and smiled. "That's voluntary abandonment," she said. "Clean and documented." My mother's legal rights ended the moment she chose performance over possession. So the locks were changed: front door, back door, garage, new brass hardware, bright, solid, stiff, and finally, a video doorbell with a two-way intercom speaker stood ready by the front entrance. Rosa helped me install the video doorbell using an online tutorial. 2 NICU nurses, 1 cordless drill, and a baby monitor balanced on the porch rail like a tiny supervisor. When we finished, I dropped the old spare keys into a kitchen drawer. They were useless now, little dead pieces of metal with no doors left to open. I didn't feel victorious. I want to be honest about that. Changing the locks on your childhood isn't a celebration. It's a tourniquet. You do it because the alternative is bleeding to death, and it hurts the entire time it's saving you. That afternoon, Brent texted me, "We're coming Sunday to talk, all of us. Kayla's boxes are already loaded in the truck. Please don't make this ugly." I stared at the message for a long time. Even his version of diplomacy came with the moving truck already packed. I typed and deleted draft after draft, the old Oilia trying to explain, apologize, compromise, and offer one more solution. Then I erased them all and sent the only thing that was true. "There's nothing left to discuss at my house. My offer to pay your deposit still stands through Friday. I love you. Please don't come." He read it at 4:12 p.m. and never replied. That night I fed Nora at 2, then again at 5. And between feedings I lay awake listening to the silence inside my house. My quiet, my home mine, while somewhere across town a moving truck sat fully loaded, pointed in our direction. My mother came back one last time before everything ended. She arrived alone on Thursday to collect the final box from the downstairs bedroom. I could have left it on the porch, but I didn't. Some conversations insist on happening face to face, no matter how much they hurt. I let her inside. She carried the box to the front door, then stopped without me saying a word. Standing there with cardboard in her arms, she finally opened the story she'd hinted at days before. "When I was 19, she said quietly, "my parents signed the family farm over to your Uncle Walt, 160 acres in Preble County. I'd been milking cows there since I was 8 years old. Walt was 17 and couldn't keep a tomato plant alive, but he was the boy. The farm went to the boy." She smiled without warmth. "My mother told me the same way you'd mention rain in the forecast. I was standing in the kitchen holding your Uncle Dale on my hip because I was always holding somebody. I watched them sign the papers, and then I set the table for supper. Nobody made room for me either, Oilia. I carried it. That's what women do. For one long moment I saw her differently, not as the woman who had hurt me, but as a 19-year-old girl standing invisible in another kitchen, watching her own inheritance disappear into someone else's hands, simply because he was born a son. My anger didn't disappear. It simply had to make room for something heavier: understanding. My mother hadn't written the story that broke her. She had inherited it, and spent 40 years convincing herself it was simply the way life worked. I looked at her and said softly, "They were wrong, Mom, and now you're doing the same thing to me." She adjusted the box against her hip, met my eyes for only a second, and answered, "It kept our family together." Then she walked out to her car. The front door closed behind her. So did another door neither of us would ever open again. The next day, Rosa came over with groceries as she always did. She unpacked oranges onto my kitchen counter as though it were her own home, looked at me, and quietly asked the only question that still mattered. "Okay," Rosa said, setting another orange into the bowl. "Walk me through Sunday, and don't give me the nurse voice." So I did. I laid out every possible outcome because I'd already rehearsed them 100 times in the dark. If I held my ground, I would keep my home, but I would almost certainly lose my mother. Not for a few months, maybe forever. Women like Carol Owens don't forgive the daughters who survive them. I'd become the villain at every family wedding, every funeral, every holiday dinner. The selfish daughter who chose paperwork over people. Brent's boys would grow up hearing a version of me that never existed. But if I surrendered, I'd get my mother's help back, Sunday dinners, the illusion of one happy family under one roof, while the deed would still carry the name Owens, just not the right owners in the end. Worst of all, my daughter would inherit the same poisoned family rule that had haunted generations before her. They matter more. Rosa listened quietly, never interrupting, until she finally asked the one question that cut deeper than anything else. Someday Nora is going to hear this story, probably from you standing right here in this kitchen. Which version do you want to tell her? That was the moment everything became clear. It had never been about whether I could survive being hated. I'd been the strong one my entire life. I already knew I could survive pain. The real question was what kind of woman my daughter would learn to become while listening to my story 20 years from now. A renter of her own life, or the rightful owner of it. I picked up my phone but didn't text a single person. Instead, I opened the doorbell app, checked the battery 100%, and quietly smiled. Some prayers aren't spoken. Some are simply careful preparation. Before Sunday arrived, I had one question for anyone listening. Standing where I stood, with your mother on one side and the deed to your home on the other, what would you have done? No judgment. Some of you have lived this exact nightmare. Saturday night, after Nora's 10 o'clock feeding, sleep refused to come. But this time it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was love. At 2 a.m, I walked into the garage, lifted my daughter's crib one piece at a time, and carried it back upstairs where it belonged. The white rails were cool from the concrete floor, and every trip up those stairs felt like reclaiming another piece of my life. I rebuilt it beneath the soft blue walls I'd painted months earlier, using the same Allen key, the same tiny wing nuts, and the same instruction sheet I'd cried over when I was 9 months pregnant, because it had cheerfully informed me. Assembly requires 2 people. Back then I'd laughed through tears, patted my belly and whispered, "Well, I've got 2. This time I didn't cry. I worked in the quiet glow of a bedside lamp with Nora's baby monitor beside me, tightening every bolt as though I were fastening my future back together. My mother had dismantled this crib in less than an afternoon, as casually as expressing an opinion. Rebuilding it took 40 minutes, 12 years of unlearning, and every ounce of strength I'd finally decided to spend on myself instead of earning someone else's approval. When it was finished, I spread the little cloud print sheet across the mattress, hung the felt stars back above it, wound the mobile, and listened as its gentle melody filled the 2 o'clock silence. Then I sat on the nursery floor looking at the room the way people look at a campfire after surviving a storm. Downstairs, the new locks guarded every door. Across town, a moving truck sat loaded, waiting for morning. My family believed they were coming to claim this room. They had no idea it was already claimed. Completely, permanently, and without apology. Before going to bed, I checked my phone one last time. Kayla had posted in the family group chat. 9 a.m. Aunt Ruth's coming too. Pray for a peaceful day. I locked the screen, turned the phone face down, and whispered, Amen. They say soldiers sleep before battles. That night, for the first time in weeks, I finally understood why. I slept 4 uninterrupted hours, woke before the alarm with a mind as clear as glass, fed Nora in the soft gray light of dawn, and welcomed Sunday without fear. Because this time, I wasn't waiting for permission to protect what was already mine. Nora's tiny hand wrapped around my finger as I looked out across the yard. The same yard I'd shoveled alone through 6 brutal winters. The same maple tree I'd paid far too much to have trimmed. The same lawn I'd mowed while 9 months pregnant, because there was no one else to do it. Every inch of that property carried my fingerprints, my sacrifices, and my receipts. For the first time in my life, I didn't rehearse a single explanation. There was nothing left to explain. That had been the greatest lesson of the spring. I'd spent 34 years carefully crafting speeches for people who had never intended to hear them, and I was finally done writing that story. Instead, I followed the only routine that had ever steadied me, a nurse's routine. I showered, poured a cup of coffee, checked the folder by the front door one last time. The deed, mortgage statement, copy of the eviction notice, my identification, everything exactly where it belonged. Then I checked the video doorbell, adjusted the camera angle, tested the intercom with Rosa over text, and quietly assessed my own condition the way I would any patient. Hands steady, breathing even, heart beating a little faster than normal, but acceptable for the seriousness of the shift ahead. Then I dressed us both. Nora wore her little yellow duck onesie because, I've learned, courage comes in the smallest sizes. I put on real clothes with real buttons, not pajamas, not survival clothes, just the clothes of a woman standing firmly inside her own life. At 8:40 that Sunday morning, I stood in my kitchen with my daughter sleeping against my shoulder, while sunlight spilled across the counter beneath the window over the sink. The house was so quiet I could hear the old maple branches brushing the gutter, the exact same sound I'd heard the day my mother first told me to leave. Same kitchen, same house, different woman. I'd spent my entire life opening doors for these people. I opened them smiling. I opened them exhausted after night shifts. I opened them grieving, pregnant, bleeding, and broken. In 34 years, I had never once tried the other choice, the one that simply left the door closed. At exactly 8:51, I heard the deep rumble of an engine turning onto Marigold Lane, pulling something heavy behind it. I rested my thumb gently on the intercom button and waited. The U-Haul needed 2 attempts to back into position, giving the entire neighborhood plenty of time to notice. Behind it rolled Kayla's SUV, followed by Aunt Ruth's sedan, a slow-moving convoy fueled entirely by certainty. From my kitchen window, I watched them arrange themselves across my front walk like a carefully staged family portrait. Brent wore a baseball cap and already looked exhausted before a single box had been unloaded. Kayla pointed the boys toward the front yard with an easy smile. "Go play," she told them. "This won't take long." Aunt Ruth stood stiffly in her Sunday church coat, arms folded across her chest, looking less like family and more like a witness arriving for an execution. And at the center of it all stood my mother, Carol Owens, wearing her best spring jacket, every strand of hair perfectly in place, holding her phone in one hand as she confidently dialed my number. She truly believed the door would open, just as it always had. She had no idea that this time, for the first time in my life, the woman standing inside that house had finally learned the power of leaving it closed. In my mother's mind, the ending had already been written. She would call, I would soften, the front door would swing open, the moving truck would be unloaded, and by dinner the family would tell the story they had planned from the beginning. The family reunited because Oilia finally came to her senses. All it required was the same thing they had always counted on, that I would fold one more time. Right on schedule, the screen door across the street creaked open, and Miss D settled into her porch chair with her knitting in her lap, quietly taking her place like a one-woman jury with the best seat in the neighborhood. One detail from that morning has never left me. They didn't knock first. Brent walked straight to the back of the U-Haul and lowered the loading ramp, the harsh scrape of metal echoing through the quiet street as if announcing their victory before the battle had even begun. Kayla carried the first box onto my porch and casually propped my screen door open with it, my front door held open by their belongings, as though the house already belonged to them. Only after the unloading had begun did my mother press the call button. It was never meant to be a conversation. It was meant to be a performance. The decision had already been made. The phone call was simply the scene that would make it look consensual. Inside my kitchen, my phone lit up on the counter and began to vibrate. "Mom." The contact photo showed her smiling. Down at Nora during my daughter's first week of life, a picture from before I understood that every kindness came with a price tag. Nora shifted gently against my shoulder as the phone continued to ring. I let it ring twice before answering. Then I heard it. That voice. Warm. Soft. Familiar. Of everything she had ever used against me, that was the one weapon I had forgotten to prepare for. It was the same voice that had comforted childhood fevers, kissed scraped knees, and tucked blankets around me before I was old enough to realize affection in our family was often transactional. She poured every remaining drop of that warmth into the call. "Oilia, sweetheart," she said gently. "Look out your window. It's everyone. Your whole family is here. Enough of this now. Open the door and everything can go back to the way it was. I'll come home. I'll help with the baby. We'll have our Sundays again, just like before. You're my daughter." Then she paused, and with heartbreaking precision, delivered the sentence she'd always known would reach for the little girl still living somewhere inside me. "All you have to do is open the door, and you can be my good girl again." I stood at my kitchen window with my phone pressed against my ear. And I'll tell you the truth about that moment because I promised honesty from the very beginning. Her words landed. Every single one of them found the little girl inside me, who had spent 34 years longing to hear that exact tenderness directed at her. Through the glass, I watched my mother standing in the driveway, her silver head bowed as she spoke into her phone. Behind her stood my brother beside the ramp of a moving truck filled with furniture meant to replace my life with his. I felt the pull like an incoming tide. The old, familiar undertow whispering that one simple yes, one unlocked door, one moment of surrender, and I could belong again. I'd be welcomed back into the family, surrounded by warmth, approval, and ownership. Then Nora stirred against my shoulder, letting out the soft, sleepy sound only a baby can make. The sound of someone whose entire world is shaped by the arms that hold her. In that instant, I realized I wasn't choosing between keeping my mother's love or losing it. I was choosing between repeating the life I'd survived or giving my daughter a different one. Those were never the same choice. "Mom," I said quietly, and the hope in her silence was almost painful to hear. "I'm going to hang up now. There's a speaker by the front door." Before she could answer, I ended the call, placed my phone gently on the kitchen counter, and walked with Nora in my arms to the intercom panel beside the entrance. The video doorbell showed them all through its wide fisheye lens. My mother stood closest to the porch, still holding her phone. Brent was halfway up the walkway carrying a box labeled "Boys' Room" in Kayla's handwriting. Aunt Ruth had lifted her chin, ready for the confrontation she'd dressed for. I stood inside my own front hall, my daughter asleep against my shoulder, my thumb resting lightly on the intercom button. People think clarity arrives like lightning. It doesn't. It feels like a room finally reaching the temperature it was always meant to be. And when I pressed the button, the small speaker crackled to life, loud enough for everyone to hear. The people on my porch, the men by the truck, even Miss D watching quietly across the street. Then I spoke the same words I had whispered to Nora in the garage the day I found her crib dismantled. "This is my house," that was all. I didn't recite the mortgage payments I'd made. I didn't quote the deed or list every sacrifice hidden beneath those walls. I didn't explain the 6 years of night shifts, the holidays I'd missed, or the dreams I'd postponed. I'd spent my entire life believing I owed people explanations for protecting myself. That morning, I finally understood the truth. Explanation had been the price of my silence, and I was done paying it. One simple sentence, spoken through a $9 speaker, carried more power than every speech I'd rehearsed over the past 34 years. On the camera screen, I watched something happen that I had never seen before. My mother's face froze. Completely. The script she'd relied on her entire life simply stopped. She looked at the speaker, then slowly lifted her eyes to the front door. The same door she'd walked through without asking for 2 years. The same kitchen she'd treated as her own. The same porch she'd stood on as though she owned the house behind it. And in that long, silent moment, reality finally settled over her. The door was not going to open. This time her daughter wasn't asking for permission. She was protecting what had always been hers. For the first time in my 34 years, the dependable daughter, the strong one, the one who had always said yes, stood behind a locked door with a spine no one had ever expected her to have. My mother's expression froze as reality finally settled in. Her fingers slowly relaxed, and her phone slipped from her hand, striking the brick edge of my flower bed, before shattering face down across the walkway. The sharp crack echoed through the still Sunday morning like the final sentence of a story none of them believed could end this way. No one bent to pick it up. My nephews stopped playing and stared in silence. Brent lowered the box labeled "Boys' Room" so carefully it was as if its weight had suddenly tripled. In truth, it had. Aunt Ruth charged toward the doorbell, pounding it with furious determination while shouting about family, sacrifice, and shame loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. Exactly as I'd expected, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply pressed the intercom and spoke with the calm, steady tone I'd learned after 12 years in the NICU. "You're on camera. You're trespassing, and the police have already been called." Then I stepped away and let the morning finish the conversation. 11 minutes later, 2 non-emergency officers arrived without sirens, flashing lights, or unnecessary drama. Just 2 professionals handling another difficult family dispute. I unlocked the front door only for them, the first turn of the new deadbolt feeling like the first real breath I'd taken in weeks. I handed over the folder I had prepared days earlier. My deed, mortgage documents, copies of the written notice, my identification, and my mother's own text message confirming she no longer lived there. One officer quietly reviewed the paperwork, while the other patiently listened as Aunt Ruth launched into a heartfelt lecture about what family was supposed to mean. In less than 15 minutes, everything was settled. That's the part movies never show. The end of a family war isn't explosive. It's administrative. The officer calmly explained to my brother that ownership wasn't a matter of opinion. The county records clearly identified me as the sole owner. Only my daughter and I legally lived in the home, and everyone else needed to pack up and leave the property immediately. Brent surprised me most. The instant the decision was taken out of his hands, his shoulders relaxed. He almost looked relieved, as though someone else had finally accepted the responsibility he'd spent his entire life avoiding. Kayla silently carried her boxes back to the truck, already rewriting the story she would tell the rest of the family. Aunt Ruth declared she would pray for me, and one officer politely answered that she was welcome to do so, from the sidewalk. My mother remained standing on the front walk for one last minute, her cracked phone hanging uselessly at her side as she stared at the front door that had once opened for her without question. Through the doorbell camera, I watched her while my thumb rested on the intercom button. One press could have been an apology. A goodbye, one final blessing between a mother and her daughter. I never pressed it, because forgiveness and reopening the door are not the same act of grace. At last she turned, climbed into Aunt Ruth's sedan, and drove away. The street slowly emptied, and with it, 34 years of carrying everyone else's expectations. When the last engine disappeared down Marigold Lane, I unlocked my front door and stepped onto my own porch with Nora sleeping peacefully in my arms beneath the warm, ordinary sunshine. Around me, the neighborhood politely pretended not to have witnessed anything at all. Curtains drifted closed. A lawnmower started somewhere in the distance. Life quietly resumed. At my feet, tiny shards of my mother's shattered phone sparkled beside the flower bed like scattered pieces of a story that no longer belonged to me, standing there in the home I had earned with years of sacrifice. I finally understood the truth that had taken a lifetime to learn. Strength isn't measured by how much of yourself you're willing to give away. Sometimes the strongest thing you'll ever do is lock the door, protect your peace, and never apologize for choosing yourself. The tiny shards of broken glass scattered beside my flower bed looked like the saddest confetti in the world. I'd sweep them up later. They were mine to clean, just like everything else that had ever happened on that front walk. But for the first time, that thought carried no resentment. It was simply true, warm and steady, like the porch railing beneath my hand. Across the street, Miss D lowered her knitting, looked at me over the top of her glasses for a long, quiet moment, then lifted her coffee mug just an inch, the kind of salute you'd give a ship that had finally made it safely into harbor. No speeches, no applause, just understanding. "Coffee's on," she called with a gentle smile. "Whenever you two are ready." And that was the moment I finally broke. I hadn't cried when my mother told me to leave my own house. I hadn't cried when I found my daughter's crib dismantled in the garage. I hadn't cried while signing the legal notice, or while standing behind the intercom telling my family they were trespassing. Through every one of those moments, I'd stayed as calm and controlled as I had during the hardest shifts in the NICU. But standing on my own porch in the warm morning sunshine, with Nora beginning to stir against my shoulder, the tears finally came. They weren't only tears of grief. They were something much deeper. The aching release of a woman who had finally laid down a burden she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be hers. I realized then that being the strong one had never meant carrying everyone else's weight. Real strength was knowing what no longer belonged on your shoulders. I wiped my face, kissed my daughter's forehead, and together we walked across the street for coffee. 6 weeks later, life had quietly settled into its new shape. Brent and Kayla rented an apartment just 2 miles from the boys' school, one of the exact listings I'd sent them. My offer to cover their first 2 months' deposit was finally accepted through a payment app. No phone call. No thank you. Just an acceptance notification. Oddly enough, that was enough. The acceptance itself said everything words never had. My mother stayed with Aunt Ruth for a while before eventually moving in with Brent and Kayla. By August, cousins who still spoke to me mentioned that Carol now had very strong opinions about Kayla's kitchen, the boys' bedtime routines, and whose name appeared on the lease. I won't pretend I never smiled at the irony. Some evenings, I picture the two of them sharing a house, both convinced they're in charge, and I have to set my tea down before I laugh out loud. As for the rest of the family, They divided the way families usually do. Not cleanly in half, but into quiet little fractions. Aunt Ruth's side simply stopped speaking to me, and in the end, that silence turned out to be far gentler than the noise I had lived with for 34 years. Not everyone disappeared. An aunt I barely knew mailed Nora a tiny onesie. A cousin quietly left a stroller on my front porch with a handwritten note that simply read, "This served us well." No explanation. No conversation. Just kindness delivered without expecting anything in return. I realized then that quiet people cast their votes differently. They don't argue in group chats. They leave packages on your doorstep. I returned to work part-time, and Rosa's Tuesday grocery deliveries slowly turned into Friday evenings with a bottle of wine and conversations that had nothing to do with surviving. Now let me tell you the final accounting honestly, because every choice has a price. It cost exactly what I thought it would. My mother never apologized. Women like Carol Owens weren't raised with that language. Somewhere, at family tables where my chair no longer exists, I'm still the daughter who chose paperwork over people. The villain in a story someone else keeps telling. Some nights that still aches, the way an old fracture reminds you it's about to rain. All my life they called me the strong one. But what they really meant was, she can carry it, so we don't have to ask whether she should. They were only half right. Yes, I was strong enough to carry it, but strength was never permission for other people to keep loading their burdens onto my back. That was simply the excuse they'd grown comfortable using, and I finally retired it from my life. In September, a letter arrived in my mother's careful cursive, the neat handwriting of a woman taught penmanship by nuns. There was no apology inside, just 2 pages about the weather, Brent's house, the boys, everyday life, and one final sentence carrying all the weight. Whatever you think of me, I am still your mother. I read it twice at my kitchen table before placing it in the same keepsake box that holds Nora's hospital bracelet. Both things can be true at once. She is still my mother, and neither truth unlocks my front door. I looked over at Nora kicking happily beneath the little felt stars hanging above her swing, already growing stronger every day, and I spoke aloud, not only to her, but to every woman in the Owens family who had ever stood in a kitchen while her future quietly passed to someone else. You matter more. Then I smiled, looked toward my front door and added, the door stays locked. The mailbox works just fine. If you remember only one thing from my story, let it be this. Love that must be earned over and over like rent will never become a home. Build your home first on your own foundation, your own name, your own peace, and then open the door only to the people who knock with respect. I spent 34 years tipping my own family simply for the privilege of having a seat at their table. The day I stopped paying, I discovered the chair had been mine all along. When I think back now, I don't remember the arguments. I remember a dismantled crib waiting in a garage, a brass key that suddenly no longer fit the lock, one calm sentence spoken through a $9 intercom, and a phone shattering on a quiet Sunday morning. Those were the moments my life changed. So if you're the strong one in your family, if your kindness has become something everyone expects instead of appreciates, hear this from one daughter to another. Your name on your own life is not selfishness. It is ownership. Protect it. And if this story found a place in your heart, subscribe to Calm Drama Stories, share your own journey in the comments, and tell me this. What was the one burden you finally put down? Until next time, keep your doors locked when they need to be, your heart open only to those who deserve it, and your boundaries strong enough to protect the life you've worked so hard to build.